Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to make another pork chop for lunch. This time I'm going to cover cutting a pork chop and some other things, but this is going to be very different from the last time. Last time, as you may remember, I cooked a pork chop and I put it on top of a vegetable melt. Today I'm going to put it on top of a red currant relish. Now, a few years ago, backstory on this whole thing, I went to Poland for a conference, and while I was there, ate at a restaurant where I noticed a lot of fruit and meat pairings. Now, as an American, the only fruit and meat pairing that I grew up with was cranberries and turkey. Of course, when I lived in Sweden, then there was also rowan berries with, say, moose or wild boar. But sort of a more general fruit-meat pairing wasn't something that I had really been closely sort of exposed to. And so this sort of kind of blew my mind wide open in terms of some things we could work with. The one thing about red currants is they're pretty sour, and so a lot of things in relation to this dish involves efforts to try to tone down the sourness. Otherwise, you end up with an extremely acidic topping for the pork, and probably something that's a bit too sour for people. But I've tried this recipe a few times. I think I've gotten something that comes out really nice, and so let's go ahead and try. So here we are, pork chops with sauteed mushrooms on a red currant relish. So first, for the relish components, we have red currants. I'm going to put some dried apricots in. These are optional, but they help liven up the flavor a little bit, and they'll absorb some of the liquid because the red currants are very soft. A lot of liquid will be generated, and it's nice to have something dry to pack in some of the, to rein in some of that liquid. I'm also going to put in at least half of this apple. It's an L-Star apple. These are great apple for applesauce, slightly tart, but not overly tart. And these two will soften up the sourness of the red currants a lot. Finally, I will add some honey. And that will sweeten it up a bit, and I will add some pine nuts. You can use other nuts as well, but I like pine nuts in this case because they have a more subtle and a less bitter flavor than you get with, say, a walnut or even a hazelnut. So these will all go into the pot for the relish, and then we'll go ahead and get started on the pork chop. For the pork chop, I'm starting with a piece of loin, and I'm going to cut a chop off of this. This is enough for probably me for most of the rest of the week for lunches. Garlic, salt, pepper, the usual. And this part's fairly simple, but we'll go ahead and go through that. Finally, for the topping, mushrooms, dry sherry, and that's basically all there is to it. I'm going to have a little oil for frying, and away we'll go. So I'm going to start by taking these, and I'm just going to pull them off the stem, put them in the pot here. We don't need to cook the stems. I don't think the stems add anything value. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to chop these up and chop up half this apple, and I will add it as well. Then I'll add the pine nuts, and once the pine nuts are added, I'll add some liquid of some kind. I'll go over a couple of different options. I like to use like a dessert wine or like a sweet cherry, but even just a little bit of water will do the trick. So away we go. Time to chop the fruits, and I'll be back in a moment once I have done that. So here we have the various fruits. And remember, the currants are pretty sour, and they will dominate the flavors, even if they're kind of on the lower end of what we have. So I'm going to start with half a pack of this. And then I'll look and see that's a pack is 50 grams, so I'm going to start with 25 grams. No, it's 100 grams, so I'll start with 50 grams. And go from there. It looks like, well, I might as well just have the rest. So I'm going to start with 100 grams here. And I'm just going to squeeze maybe the equivalent of a tablespoon or two of honey on top. Then I'm going to go ahead and add some sweet cherry. You can also use a marsala. You could even just use a little bit of water. The key point is you need a little bit of liquid in here so that the currants sort of get exposed to all the heat and can start to break down. Otherwise, you may end up with stuff just burning. I'm going to go ahead and cook this. I'm going to start it on high until it boils, and then I'll turn it down to about medium. On to the pork chop. Now, the thing about a pork chop is the thinner it is, the easier it is for it to get really dry, because you can overcook it and the juices are just going to get pushed all the way through. So I like to cut a pork chop about 4 or 5 centimeters thick. So I just lay my finger down. You can go, that's like 5 centimeters maybe. This is more like 4. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off about 1/3 of this. So that's about 4 centimeters. It's almost maybe 1.5 inches. And this is going to be my pork chop. See, it's nice and thick. And because it's nice and thick, when I cook it, I can cook it under a high heat initially, and then I can turn the heat down. But the juices are mostly going to stay inside. And that's super important, as we'll see. On each side of the pork chop, I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle a nice amount of garlic, a bit of salt. Another advantage of having thick pork chops is that you can salt the outside a little bit more, and that can lead to a nicer texture on the outside. So, sorry. And then a bit of salt, and there's our pork chop. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to start to cook this, usually after the relish has been cooking for 3 or 4 minutes. And then I will, in the meantime, be slicing the mushrooms. So while I'm waiting for this pan to heat up so I can cook the pork chop, I've taken the lid off of the relish. You can see all the currants have basically liquefied very quickly. And so what I'm left with are the nuts and apples and dried apricots stewing in the very sour black currant juice. Now, one other thing you could use for the liquid there might be like a fruit juice, apple juice, or even a berry juice like an elderberry or a cranberry juice. So I'll leave that up to you to experiment with. But we're just going to let this kind of cook and thicken up and stew down a little bit. In the meantime, we're waiting for this pan to get hot enough that I can cook the pork chop on it. Now I can feel this pan's getting very hot. I have it on a high. If you're cooking a thick pork chop like this, the way to do it is to cook it on high at first and then turn it down once both sides are getting brown. So I'm going to go ahead and let this cook for a couple minutes. Then I'll flip it over and you'll be able to see it get nice and brown. And then we'll go ahead and turn the heat down on it. So now I've turned this over, you can see it's getting nice and brown. Now that I've turned it over, I'm going to turn this down from high to about a little over medium. And we're just going to let this cook for another 5-10 minutes, and then I'll flip it over again and we'll see where we are. But you can see this is turning very nicely brown, and this is going to be very good. So now I think this is pretty close to being done. So we're going to take this off, and we're going to let the meat sit for maybe 5 minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to cook the mushrooms. As before, I'm going to turn the heat back up to high. And I just want to show you this. I've taken this off the heat, but you can see the amount of juice has gone way down, and it's thickened up a lot, and that's what we're looking for in this. So this is now done. So I'm going to go ahead and stir these mushrooms for a bit as the pan heats up again. They will absorb most of the oil from the pan. They will also start to cook. And in a few moments, I'm going to add the dry sherry. Yeah, I think it's time for the sherry now. Now, once the sherry's been added, it's very important that we stir the bottom of this, because what we really want from the sherry in part is for the pieces of cooked meat and drippings that have come out to get picked up and carried into the mushrooms. So here we are. And as the sherry is mostly gone now, I'm going to consider this done. So let's take this off the heat and put everything together. So here we go. Relish goes onto the plate first. And I'm going to spread it out. So I have a very thin layer of relish, around at least a third of the plate. And for dinner, maybe I would pair this with maybe parsnips or potatoes, maybe like, you know, boiled or riced potatoes or something. And then I'm going to go ahead and just kind of arrange this on top. And then I can just kind of put the mushrooms both on and around the meat. That little bit of sauce I'm going to drizzle over the top. And there we go. Just arrange these a little bit. And so here is this pork chop on our red currant relish with sauteed mushrooms and sherry. And now for the taste test. Taking a small piece of pork here from the side. The fruity flavors of the relish really complement the pork very nicely. The mushrooms are tasty on their own, but the real distinctive aspect of the dish is this relish. And it's pretty sour still, but it's still a bit sweet. And it's very rich. It's something that you could almost eat by dessert, for dessert by itself, but it's also sour enough that it goes very nicely with this meat. And frankly, this is delicious, and I'd invite any of you to try to make this. Hope that you enjoy it. Bon appetit.